Okay, guys, so welcome back. This is the third part in my series on the French Revolution, and we are going to talk about a few more of the major events. The first one being the storming of the Bastille. So as you can see on the screen, this takes place on July 14th of 1789, and it is indeed a major turning point in the revolution. So Parisian crowds, or crowds from Paris, that is, go in search of weapons and they end up attacking and capturing a royal armory, which also happened to be a prison. There, they think they're going to find a lot of prisoners of despotism who were unjustly imprisoned by the royal family, but in reality, there were only 7. 2 of those people were mentally ill, and there were 5 people that had forged signatures. So not serious crimes, right? In fact, a couple of them not a crime at all. So what they do is they go in and they free the prisoners. And the storming of the Bastille is more important for its symbolic nature than it probably is for what actually happened. It becomes a popular symbol of triumph over despotism and a symbol of the cause of liberty. And it is still recognized and celebrated to this day in France, of course. So Louis XVI at this point has pretty much lost his authority. He starts backing down and realizes he's kind of in trouble and he needs to do some compromising. But unfortunately for Louis, it's probably too little too late. Meanwhile, popular revolutions are springing up all over France, both in the cities and in the countrysides, and peasants are rising up as well, thinking that the king had agreed that their tithes and obligations ought to end. So there's a lot of rumors flying around and a lot of people in an uproar. So less than a week later, on July 20th, rumors start going around about nobles hiring outlaws to terrorize peasants. There are rumors about foreign troops that were about to invade. Some believe there was some aristocratic plot out there. And then peasants start directing their anger at their landlords, and they start looting and ransacking their houses, and they start tearing up legal papers. And now the king and queen are forced to move to Paris, where they can be under the watchful eye of the people. So all of these things are going on, right? And the revolutionary activities are sort of taking on a life of their own. Sorry, my dog is growling in the background. I apologize. So the National Assembly, this newly formed National Assembly, responds. On August 4th of 1789, in response to the Great Fear, it drafts a new constitution. And what they really want to do is to destroy all relics or all remains of feudalism in France, all aristocratic privileges, all those things that felt very unfair, that the first and second estates had, privileges that they had that the third estate didn't have. And of course, a lot of urban bourgeoisie or middle class people are willing to abolish feudalism as a matter of principle. So on August 4th, 1789, the National Assembly votes to abolish all seigneurial rights as well as privileges of the nobility and the clergy. So all of those special rights that only the first 2 estates had. And also, along with that, one thing that really got to the peasants was that the upper classes had hunting rights to hunt on their land and take whatever they shot. And that was often the food for the peasants themselves. And so they didn't like the upper classes just being able to come on their land and take whatever they wanted. And so those rights, those special hunting rights, also became abolished or were abolished. Then on August 26th, they draft a new document called the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. And this is a charter of basic liberties. And these liberties that they outline, or these freedoms, reflect the ideas of the Enlightenment philosophers and also the ideas of the American Declaration of Independence. So a few of the things that they declare in this document are an affirmation of the natural rights of man, that men are born with certain rights. By the way, it was specifically men and not women, and that's another issue we will get into shortly. But they did affirm that all men are born with natural rights in the vein of John Locke and some of the other Enlightenment thinkers. They affirm the destruction of aristocratic privileges, as I mentioned. They talk about equal rights for all men, access to public office based on talent or merit rather than based on family name or birth. They write about restricting the monarchy. So what they really are thinking about is a limited constitutional monarchy at this point. They demand that all citizens are allowed to participate in the legislative process or the process of making laws. They declare that freedom of speech and press is a right. They outlaw arbitrary arrests, so no longer can a king just throw you in jail because you forged a check or whatever, as they found when they stormed the Bastille. And so they want there to be only legitimate reasons for imprisoning people. And of course, as I mentioned, these rights did not extend to women. And that really obviously angered a lot of women, particularly because women were so actively involved in the revolution at this point. And so one woman in particular, named Olympe de Gouges, starts rallying for women. She was a female playwright and pamphleteer, and she says, of course, these rights should include women. And so she drafts another constitution called the Declaration of the Rights of Woman and the Female Citizen. But of course, this is rejected by the National Assembly because most of the men on that assembly did not believe women were equal in either intellectual capacity or naturally born with the same innate qualities and rights as men. And so they end up rejecting her document. Sadly, she ends up being executed by guillotine later for some other ideas that she had that the people in power at the time did not agree with. But for the AP exam, you definitely need to know who Olympe de Gouges was and what her role was in the woman's question. Meanwhile, back at the Palace of Versailles, the king remains passive, oblivious. He is just really not the sharpest tool in the shed. And he refuses to endorse the demands laid out by the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. And on October 5th, about 6,000 working women, who I guess are referred to as the fish ladies. They're pretty hardcore. They're used to lifting heavy, baskets, and they are not women that you really want to mess with. They march on Versailles to protest the exorbitant price of bread, because at this point, the price of bread was just so high that it made it almost impossible to feed your family. And so and if you recall from one of the videos we watched, they ended up mixing a lot of the flour with sawdust just to try to fill people's stomachs, because it was so expensive to get flour. And there was a rumor going around that there was grain stores that the king and queen were hiding in their palace. And so these women want to go in and they want to get the king and queen to bring out the grain stores and provide them with what they need to make bread. It's probably also important to mention that they didn't just come with, just come for a peaceful protest. They came with pikes in their hands, with cannons. It was pouring rain. The patriots start joining them in the streets. That is some of the more revolutionary factions of the population. And the king is, realizing that he's in big trouble. And so he is forced to do something. So he brings flour out, or has his servants bring flour out from the palace stores. And he's just trying to appease the crowds and save his life. And what he's really hoping is that this is going to end the protests and everything is going to calm down as a result. But the Paris National Guard, led by a man that you may be familiar with, Lafayette, significant role in the American Revolution. So the National Guard led by Lafayette marches on to Versailles, and the king, like I said, brings the flour out from the palace stores, and the women start escorting him, singing. And what is really clear now is that the king has to accept the orders of the National Assembly. He has no other choice. And this is really significant because it's the first time in French history that a grassroots movement has prevailed. So a movement of the people, not a movement from the top down, but a movement from the bottom up. And at this point, this is when the royal family is forced to move to Paris. So I want to just mention briefly before I end this video a little bit about the Catholic Church at this point. Why was the Catholic Church so resented? It was viewed as part of the old order, the ancient regime, right? I'm not even going to try to pronounce the French, but the church owned a lot of land and had a lot of power. And remember, the clergy were in the first estate. They had special privileges. So the church was forced by the revolutionaries to give up all their land, and the state would then sell it off for money. So this paper money was issued based on the collateral of the newly nationalized church property. That is, all that church property just becomes owned by the nation rather than by the church. And at this point, the revolutionaries decide that they are going to secularize the church. And so they force something called the Civil Constitution of the Clergy in July of 1790. So think about this. This is in just about a year, all the changes that have already been made. The Civil Constitution of the Clergy is put into effect, and church officials are now to be elected by the people and paid by the state. And interestingly enough, at this point, the clergy are supposed to swear allegiance, not to the Pope, not to the church, but to the nation of France. And they have to vow that they're going to live according to the rules of this new civil constitution. The Pope forbids this, so only 54% of parish clergy actually agreed to this or signed it. And most of the bishops refused. But it's really significant because now the church has become viewed as an enemy of the state, and a permanent wedge is driven between the church and the state, as well as between peasants and middle class over this issue, because peasants tend to be a lot more conservative than the middle classes, and they were very resentful that the state had done this. And that wraps us up for now. In the next video, we will talk about the new Constitution drafted in 1791. And by the way, you might want to keep track of how many constitutions are continually being drafted during the French Revolution. But that is for the next video. Hope you got something out of this, and we will see you next time.